Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event hosted by the Korea Economic Institute of America, After Trump, American Attitudes Toward the Korean Peninsula. Hopefully, everyone's in the right place. We're very excited to have this discussion today. I am Shannon Tiezi, Editor-in-Chief at The Diplomat, and I've had the pleasure of quite frequently publishing articles from KEI experts and fellows, and including the two gentlemen who are joining me here today. We have Troy Stangarone, who is the Senior Director and Fellow at the Korea Economic Institute, and Junie Kim, who's the Senior Manager for Operations and Technology at KEI. And they are both here in particular because they were spearheading the KEI side of a joint survey project done by KEI and YouGov. So they started this annual collaboration in 2020. This is 2021, the second year of results, and hope to continue this on an annual basis going forward. And given that, we're going to be focusing on what changes we can see from 2020, since obviously there was a change in U.S. administrations and U.S. Korea policies from the Trump administration to the Biden administration in the interim. But I would like everyone to keep in mind that this is just a selection of highlights. There is a lot more to explore in the full report, which you can find on the KEI website. And we're also going to drop a link in the chat on YouTube as well. So be sure to check that out. But to start our discussion, I wanted to begin with sort of a broader focus. I think Junie has some slides ready to share with you. So we're going to take a look at the question of which countries Americans consider to be critical partners of the United States. And you can see in the survey results that, that Junie has put up from us, that the top partners are the United Kingdom at 70%, Canada at 70%, the EU at 54%. Then you have Japan, Israel, Australia, South Korea. You can see it goes on down the list. Now, we've heard from administrations for a decade plus now that the Asia-Pacific, now often called the Indo-Pacific, is the most critical region for U.S. interests. And yet, if you ask Americans, they see the top three critical partners of the U.S. as European or Canada. So I wanted to start with that sort of divergence. Obviously South Korea, that has implications for South Korea specifically, but it also has implications for US Asia policy as a whole. So Troy, did you want to start out with your thoughts on what might be driving this discrepancy?
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. Thanks for coming here today to talk with us about the results. We're very excited to have you, and we hope to get some of your insights as well today as we go through this discussion. I think when we look at this, and one thing I'd like to note, we did make a slight change on this question from last year. Last year, we asked who Americans viewed as friends and who Americans viewed as adversaries. But we realized we wanted to actually try to dig deeper and find out who Americans viewed as critical partners for the United States, not just a country that we were friendly with, because there is some distinction there. But I do think, to get to your direct question, we noticed really this sort of European focus of foreign policy over the last 7 years, the post-World War II foreign policy, the dominance of NATO in US strategy. And I think a lot of Americans, haven't really taken and really moved their focus to the Indo-Pacific, to the security structures that we've historically had in the region were bilateral relations rather than merely collective security similar to NATO. And also, while we are trying to build up those security relations with groupings like the Quad, they are still nascent. I think, even the administration might be difficult to really define what the role of the Quad is. So I think, what we're seeing here is that Americans know that South Korea is an important ally of the United States. We can see, if you look at the data, basically, you have a large group of Americans who are unsure about the role of a lot of these countries. But at the same time, you have a strong plurality of 41% who view South Korea as critical. We see Japan slightly higher, 52%, perhaps not surprising given the rise of Japan in the 80s and everything. It's been in the United States consciousness much longer. But I think it's really what we're seeing is that while the policy world is maybe focusing or shifting to the Indo-Pacific, much of the American public is still focused on the European theater and our traditional allies there.
Yeah, and this has been kind of a perennial issue for U.S. administrations. There's a lot of skepticism in Asian policymaking communities that the United States is really serious about Asia and really serious about making the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific a priority. So Junie, what do you think are the implications of this for South Korea? Is this something that South Korea should be worried about or concerned about, or is it just kind of an interesting footnote to pay attention to?
Sure, yeah, and to add to Troy's point that he mentioned that the 41% in and of itself may seem not that high if you just say the 410 Americans have a favorable view of South Korea, but you really have to look at that large amount of unsure, that 52%, because and really the net positive here is actually pretty high. You have 41% of people who see South Korea as a critical partner, as opposed to 7% who don't. But that 52% is really where South Korea can gain a lot of ground and be one of the countries that we see up here higher on the list that are seen as a critical partner by the U.S. And there's plenty of room for improvement for that.
Yeah, I wanted to take us to another slide that would seem to undercut this and complicate it a little bit more, which is the percentage of Americans who think that East Asia is strategically important for the United States. And I'll let Junie get the slide up, but there's a large number of Americans, as a spoiler alert, who think that that Asia is an important region for U.S. interests. And you can see that in this slide, which tells us the respondents' the views on the most critical challenges to the United States. China is number one, followed by Russia, Afghanistan, and it's important to note here that this survey was done late August, early September. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So obviously Afghanistan was hugely in the news in that period, and we might have gotten different results if the survey was being done now a month earlier. I'm sure the results would have been different as well, but still Afghanistan is ranked number 3, then North Korea and Iran. And depending on how you define the Indo-Pacific, that means 4 out of 5 of the most critical challenges facing the US, according to survey respondents, are in the Indo-Pacific. And yet Americans see the US's most critical partners as outside of the Indo-Pacific. So there's an interesting dichotomy there as well, which obviously calls into question the role of Europe in the Indo-Pacific. But also, I think it speaks to Troy's point, which is that this might just be a slow process, that Americans realize that the US has a central interest in the Indo-Pacific, but this legacy of 70 years of focusing largely on Europe is just going to take some time to overcome.
And I think one other thing, if we look, India fared fairly poorly on US views as a critical partner in the last slide. And if we look through the capabilities of our potential partners in the region, as opposed to our European partners, there are constraints that necessarily they don't have that our European partners have. Japan has its own constitutional constraints on where and how it can engage its military. South Korea is now only building really a more robust Navy. It's largely due to North Korea focused on its army. So it hasn't necessarily, while it's provided a large number of troops in U.S. operations abroad, and actually is one of the top 3 countries in providing U.S. troops in U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We really need to sort of look more broadly at the capabilities of the region. In this sense, the public isn't wrong on what our partners or who's critical in the region. I mean, you can sort of see this in the new Australia, UK, US agreement that, even there we're bringing the UK into the region to try and help. France clearly has its own role to play given its possessions within the region and its own naval force. India is a potentially promising partner in time, but at the moment it doesn't necessarily have the capabilities of a lot of our other allies in Europe. So I think that also points to the challenges for U.S. strategy in the region, is that our partners have their own constraints that some of our European partners despite our complaints about that they haven't over time kept up their militaries, perhaps still don't lack. And Junie, if you don't mind, we do have the other polling question on whether Americans view the Indo-Pacific as a critical region. If you wouldn't mind, when you get a moment, maybe pulling that up as well. I think, Shannon, to the broader point, and thanks, Judy, for bringing this up. The one thing we can see is not only have Americans identified, countries in the region has vital challenges, but they do view the Asia Pacific as a critical region for the United States. We can see, we asked whether East Asia is viewed as a vital region for U.S. national interests. 62% of Americans thought it was. And if we look at the data more deeply, we also asked a follow-up question. Do you believe, or why do you think it's important for the United States to be in East Asia? And what we found is that, 28% of Americans believe that it's to defend our friends and allies, but 43% believe it's to counter the rise of China. And so you have both of these two threads kind of coming together. And interestingly, when we looked at the data on some of the questions regarding troop support, which we'll talk about later, in the region in South Korea specifically, you find that Americans who are favorable for being involved in the East Asian region for trade and economic reasons are not necessarily supportive of having U.S. troops there. So there is a bit of dichotomy as well that we see in the data.
And just to add to Troy's point and to wrap this slide with some of the previous data that we're taking a look at, it's very clear that China and Russia were both seen as the top two critical foreign policy challenges this year and last year. And although we did see Afghanistan rise higher on that list, and this was right after the withdrawal from Kabul and all the media attention that associated with that, North Korea was still very high in terms of being seen as an adversary. Actually, to go to the first slide that we had, North Korea was rated as the top adversary. They actually topped even Russia and China. And so the combination of those three countries, China, Russia, and North Korea, from the American standpoint, do represent very significant challenges to the U.S. That are recognized by the general public.
I think that this also has implications for the U.S.-South Korea relationship and possibly might be coloring American perceptions of South Korea as a critical partner, because there is some divergence between the United States and South Korea in how they view China. China is an immensely important economic partner for South Korea, and South Korean governments, not just the current Moon administration, but the previous Park administration, they have been reluctant to antagonize China. And there has been a sense of needing to thread the needle and not go too far to the United States side. Certainly joining the Quad is something that's often been discussed in the United States as a possibility for South Korea, but there's a lot of concern about taking that step in Seoul. So I think that's something else to pay attention to, is if Americans think East Asia is a critical national interest because of China, that could cause frictions in the U.S.-South Korea alliance further down the line.
I think, this is a good point. And it's going to be one of the challenges that South Korea is going to face, is that as Americans become more focused on China, the question is going to be, what role can South Korea play in managing that challenge? I think there's two ways for policymakers to look at this, which is one, do we take an approach in the region that is very Quad focused and that we build out the Quad, or do we take one that is much more nuanced and that sort of one looks functionally at where our partners in the region can actually provide support? So there are certain areas to where, South Korea would be a clear partner for the United States in trying to manage the challenge from China, and others where maybe it brings less to the table than some other partners. And so if we look at things more functionally, I think, we'll be able to find more balance in our relationship, both with South Korea, but that'll also then provide space for South Korea to manage its relations with China. And I think, there is value as well in having South Korea and China maintain good relations, in that we want our allies to be able to talk to China to try and manage crises as well. If this ends up, which I think everybody in the region we know wants to avoid, sort of in a one side or the other situation, that's something that I think is going to be uncomfortable in Seoul. It'll be uncomfortable in the United States. So I think ultimately it's about how we find the ways where we can work best together in the areas where we are most capable to take and really manage the rise from China. So some of this clearly for South Korea is going to be on the tech side, given their role in 5G, given their role in semiconductors and some other tech areas. There will be some military component to this, but it may not be as large as for some other countries.
And something just to add to the point that Troy was making too, we saw some of the trickiness of South Korea's balance with that just the past few years, even because we saw the impact that the deployment of THAAD missile batteries in South Korea and the economic blowback that China had on South Korea, both officially and unofficially. We saw a lot of Korean businesses and Korean cultural products suffer in China as a result from that.
I think for the United States, this is a question it needs to answer if it wants greater South Korean involvement, which is that when that happened, the U.S. response was basically non-existent. There were mentions of this in private meetings with the Chinese, but beyond that, my understanding is the United States didn't take any steps. And so we now know with Australia and with other countries, China is clearly willing to engage in economic coercion. And so if the U.S. isn't willing to take steps to counter that economic coercion, it makes it less likely that South Korea or other partners, to be honest, in the region are going to be willing to go along with U.S. efforts, because the question in all of those capitals is going to be, all right, that's fine, but if China takes and cuts off trade in product X and we lose jobs, how are you going to help support us through this challenge? And so I think this is one of the differences between the Cold War and the current competition with China, which I think is one reason why the Cold War isn't necessarily a good analogy, is that we now have a much more integrated world, and China has more sources of influence than perhaps the Soviet Union did at the time. And so we're going to have to be more nuanced as well in the steps we take.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Troy, which obviously this discussion is focused on South Korea because that's what the survey is focused on, but this is not a problem that's unique to South Korea. Pretty much all of Southeast Asia, most of China's neighbors, even many countries in Europe have the same concerns about the U.S. potentially becoming too far into an anti-China stance. So this is something that is going to continue to dog U.S. foreign policy for years with all of its partners. But I want to turn now to an issue that is more unique to the U.S.-South Korea relationship, and that is North Korea. That's another country that Americans solidly view as a threat to the United States. As you mentioned, it's actually the top viewed adversary for the United States. And obviously, we've seen a huge change in the administration approaches from Donald Trump holding several summits with Kim Jong-un. Now the Biden administration is in office, signaling that they want to try a more quiet diplomatic approach without much luck so far. So let's take a look at what the survey found on U.S. views of North Korea. And particularly, we're going to look at the change. You can see that the amount of people who approve has gone way down. It's 18% now. It was 31% in the 2020 survey. The amount of people who disapprove has also gone down, although not by quite as much. The amount of people who are not sure has jumped. And it seems like that's the biggest change, is more people don't know what is going on with North Korea. And I think partially this is just a result of the fact that Biden's diplomatic approach is quieter. He's not, or at least yet, he hasn't held a summit with Kim Jong-un. He's not writing love letters. There's not this bromance narrative between the top two leaders. But we are seeing, North Korea launching missiles and Kim Jong-un making fiery speeches like the one he just gave yesterday. So that might be coloring U.S. perceptions a little bit, just the fact that the U.S. stance is less high profile now, whereas North Korea is every bit as high profile as it's ever been in its military capabilities. But we've also discussed, Troy, Junie, how even we who are, experts who devote our lives to studying this stuff are not quite sure what the Biden approach on North Korea is. So maybe it's not surprising that so many Americans are kind of reserving judgment on the effectiveness.
Yeah, obviously the general public doesn't necessarily have the opportunity that we have to talk to policymakers here and everything. And so if you just look at sort of what the Biden administration's public policy has been on North Korea, it's consisted essentially of a short statement that was in roughly essence of, we won't be as forward engaging as the Trump administration, but we won't be as passive as the Obama administration. In essence, the Goldilocks approach. And I think, it's really hard for most Americans when, there's probably been some news they may have come across of, for example, Sung Kim meeting with, our partners in South Korea and Japan and one of his Russian colleagues as well. But I mean, beyond that, I think it's really hard to discern if you're part of the American public, really right now, what the Biden administration's North Korea policy is. For the Biden administration, that probably is reflective of some other realities of that. One, the pandemic is clearly a priority. Two, the competition with China is always going to take priority, I think, over North Korea policy. I like to say sometimes that North Korea is just important enough to not be important enough. So I think, once again, you're in that situation where there are other priorities for the administration. They've put a lot of focus on trying to ensure that Iran doesn't cross the nuclear threshold. So, even when you look beyond China and foreign policy, they've focused, a lot of attention there. They've been trying to repair relations with European partners with perhaps mixed success, if we're being honest, given some of the recent things like the agreement with Australia and the break in relations with France. But so I just think that even if you move beyond the domestic side, if you look on the foreign policy side, there's been a lot of focus or need of focus because the pandemic clearly should be the priority, over some of these other issues that the administration has been focused on. And so it's not surprising that North Korea wouldn't have gotten the public attention from the Biden administration yet that, it may in the future. But at this point, I think, it's really hard if you're the public to discern that. One other thing, though, that I think is interesting when you look at last year's data, and even if you can look at like the subnote here on this, where it says, 33% of Democrats approve of the administration's handling of North Korea, only 7% of Republicans. When Trump was president, Democrats highly disapproved of, the administration's approach to North Korea. Republicans approved of it. So North Korea, to an extent on policy, has become a slightly partisan issue over the last few years.
Yeah, and something else to note about this, the data that we're seeing here as well, as Troy mentioned, it's kind of expected to see that the nationally representative sample, there'd be a large amount of people that are unsure. But I think what would be very concerning if for the Biden administration is to look at that specific sample of those that follow Asia-Pacific news. Even among them, 34% are unsure, which is a higher amount than the national representative sample last year. So even among those that consider themselves more fans of following developments in the Asia-Pacific, even they're more unsure than the layperson last year was over what the current administration's North Korean policy is. And on top of that as well, you see that for that specific group, there's a larger increase of those that disapprove than approve, which is also something that's concerning.
Yeah, I think there's a sense that or concern among some Korea watchers and certainly some South Korean America watchers that the Biden policy is deja vu all over again. It's a strategic patience redux, which didn't really accomplish anything under the Obama administration. So that's something that we're all going to be keeping an eye on because as we've discussed, this is still early. Biden hasn't been in office even for a full year. So we don't really know at this point what exactly his approach is going to be and how successful it's going to be. And I think reserving judgment might be the wisest choice at the current moment.
And I think the thing that I would add is, the State Department said this a couple of times, which is that we have tried to reach out to the North Koreans to engage in talks and that, in essence, they haven't picked up the phone. And so, in the Biden administration's events, it's hard to engage North Korea if they won't engage, the United States. Now, there could be a question about approach, meaning that at the moment, North Korea is essentially, it's not allowing travel between its borders. Trade is very minimal right now. It's finally accepted a little bit of WHO medical assistance, but, in essence, hasn't taken any assistance to deal with the pandemic. If COVID-19 were to break out, and there have been questions about whether it has already, it would be very difficult for the North Korean government or regime to handle a massive outbreak within the country. So there's a question about approach in the sense of, one, is North Korea really interested in having discussions with the United States about its nuclear programs while we're in the middle of a pandemic? And two, at the same time, you have this deeper question, I think, of, is the U.S. approach really still focusing on North Korea? And, we saw this with all kinds of commentary and op-eds when Biden won that, he had to immediately engage North Korea on the nuclear issue to avoid a crisis. Well, yes, North Korea has tested some missiles, but we've largely avoided a crisis. But the real crisis on the peninsula right now is the pandemic. And, I'm sure the Biden administration has been talking to North Korea about trying to provide assistance, but perhaps, we haven't had the right focus as well. And that could be a challenge at this point.
So I do want to look a little bit more specifically at U.S. views on denuclearization of North Korea and circle back around to a point that Troy made earlier about the question of prioritization. I think most Americans agree that it would be great if North Korea denuclearized. But the question is, how much energy and time do you devote to that goal? And different administrations have had different answers to that question. And we can see the survey results on what Americans think the importance of North Korea giving up its military nuclear capabilities. Obviously, a sizable amount think it's very important, a flat majority of 55%. And then if you add on the Americans who think it's important, you have an overwhelming majority of Americans who think this is something that's in the U.S. national interest. And those have shifted a little bit, but are roughly in line with 2020. So even though the marks that Americans are giving to the administrations may be shifting, and as we noted, there's some partisan elements at play there, the fact that this should be a goal for the United States has not really changed since 2020. But that being said, if we think back to the ranking of critical national security concerns through the United States, North Korea got leapfrogged, right, by Afghanistan. And that's, I think, partially a quirk of the survey's timing, but I do think it's indicative that in most Americans' minds, North Korea is a threat that, as Troy said, it's important, but not quite important enough. That maybe the crisis of the day is going to always outstrip North Korea, whereas China and Russia are kind of in this top tier of perennial national security challenges in many Americans' minds, and North Korea just isn't quite up there. So I know that this is a perception that many South Korean policymakers find frustrating, that they can't get U.S. attention to focus on North Korea as much as it deserves. And yet here we have many Americans saying that they do view it as important. So again, a little bit of a divergence there.
Yeah, and I think, for the administration in a way, this is actually the good news. There is very clear views of the United States that North Korea's nuclear weapons are not acceptable. And, if we look at this, it's not just, a small number. It's 55% of the public think it's very important to have North Korea give up its nuclear weapons. And so I think that really stands out, that it's the very important column there. And 31% more believe that it's an important issue. So if the administration is able to engage North Korea on talks, you can see there would be clearly strong support amongst the public for some process that would lead to this outcome. And so I think, that's one important thing for the administration to take, and for our partners in South Korea, that this is an issue that actually matters a great deal to the American public.
And just to add to that as well, the sidebar mentions here that there is a little bit of variance between self-identified Republicans and Democrats, but still majority support. And that's something that we've noted in the 2020 survey as well, that there was strong bipartisan support for to try to press North Korea on giving up its military nuclear capabilities, which is also, if you put in the context of what we were looking at before too, where you would expect a more partisan response for the overall approval rating of the administration's North Korea policy handling. On the core issue of what we're looking at, there is broad bipartisan support by the American public overall.
And Shannon, you had mentioned Afghanistan and how it, somewhat because of the timing of the survey, obviously is much more in the American conscience than perhaps it would have been otherwise. And I think that's clearly the case. This survey was in the field basically from the day the last U.S. troops left Afghanistan to about a week afterwards. So clearly it was something that was primarily in the public's mind. But we were preparing this to go into the field, and we knew that the withdrawal was happening, and so we actually did want to try to find out sort of what the public thought. And so we asked one question, in essence, does the process or does the situation in Afghanistan change your views of other U.S. security commitments abroad? And what we essentially found was that while there was a small minority who said yes, that to a large extent, it really didn't play a role in the thought of the American public. And so you can see here, 35% of Americans said it had no impact on their views of other security commitments. 22% actually, interestingly, said that it was made them more likely to be supportive of U.S. commitments abroad, but only 14% said it made them less likely to. So I think while there's been a lot of questions that might have come up about whether the withdrawal from Afghanistan showed that the U.S. was going to be less likely to support our partners abroad, from the American public's perspective, at least, Afghanistan really was a unique situation, and we've seen that in other polling to where it suggested that at least a small majority of Americans, are in mid 50% or so, supported the withdrawal. And so I think this kind of bears out in our survey as well, that while clearly people can have different views on the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, it doesn't necessarily impact their view on the situation in South Korea.
Yeah, that's a great jumping off point for the next topic I want to address. But first, I do want to remind anyone who's watching this live on YouTube, you can ask questions in the chat. I'll be watching that and selecting questions to ask and bring into our discussion. But I wanted to take Troy's point and move on to a second point. We've talked about how the views on denuclearization of North Korea are very consistent and not much change. You can also say the same about U.S. views of South Korea in terms of both having a positive view of South Korea. Those results have been fairly consistent, but also the support for the alliance, the support for keeping U.S. troops. That's an area where we haven't seen a lot of change, which is a really good sign for the U.S.-South Korea alliance. So while Americans might not be ranking South Korea, up there with the UK and the EU and Canada as the most critical US partner, I think it's important to underline that they do see South Korea as an important partner, as a friend in the language that was used in this survey in the past, and generally have positive opinions of South Korea.
No, yeah, I think, this is one of the things that, is a positive of our relationship as well. 65% of Americans have either a very favorable or a favorable opinion. That's roughly the same as last year. We've seen some of this shift in terms of whether it's very favorable or just favorable. But, there are probably some factors such as how South Korea has handled COVID that maybe has sort of shifted some of this. But, in essence, there's a strong core of goodwill towards South Korea and the United States.
And just to add to that, so the consistency, I think, is really heartening from South Korean point of view, that consider all the things that have changed over the past year, let alone just the administration change, that we had a previous administration that questioned the nature of our alliances and what it means for the U.S. commitment to its partners around the world, to one that is re-emphasizing that commitment. But the U.S. public overall has a fairly consistent view on this issue. So it's really great to see that despite the kind of ping-ponging administration policy changes, that the public has been very consistent on this.
And one last thing I would just note on this is that, while, about 25% of Americans aren't sure of their opinion on South Korea, there's very few Americans who have a negative opinion of South Korea. And so even if, one looks at this and says, well, it's only 65%, that's good, but, maybe it could be better, or some other countries are better. Basically, the opinion Americans have of South Korea is sort of either neutral or positive. Very few Americans have a negative view of South Korea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's instructive to look at the sample who identified as closely following international news and Asia-Pacific news specifically. The favorability rating jumps up dramatically versus the amount of people who say they're not sure. So I think that speaks to your point, Troy, that as people do learn more about South Korea, they tend to go from the not sure to the favorable camp. You can see actually the unfavorable and very unfavorable respondents dropped in both of those categories compared to the nationally representative group. And I think we also have a slide specifically on support for US troop numbers in South Korea, which is interesting to bring up given the Trump administration, especially President Trump himself often spoke quite loudly about why do we have US troops in South Korea? Maybe we should pull them out. Maybe if South Korea doesn't pay us enough money, we'll pull them out. And obviously the Biden administration has reinvigorated all the US alliances, really emphasized its commitment and support. And we can see that, as Troy said, for the views of South Korea generally, the views on US troops in South Korea specifically are remarkably consistent, considering the completely opposite messagings that we are seeing from the Trump and Biden administration. You still have, 57 versus 56% of Americans think we should either maintain or increase US troops in South Korea. So it seems like there is this sort of public opinion inertia that is not really being swayed by whatever the administration of the day is saying, which again, I think is a good thing for the alliance.
Junie, I want to highlight, you've actually written on this for Shannon the Diplomat. Do you want to maybe give your thoughts to sort of start off on this?
Sure, yeah. So one of the reasons why we include that question about how the Afghanistan withdrawal might affect U.S. views on security commitments around the world is to look at this specifically, to see how does that affect how Americans look at South Korea. The short answer is no, that most Americans are discerning enough to understand the differences between the Afghanistan situation compared to South Korea. And just as we saw a little bit earlier, they understand some of the core interests that the threat of North Korea is still something that is very relevant and something that a lot of Americans understand. And so the US commitment to South Korea, even by the general population of the US, largely understands the purpose of why we have troops in South Korea.
I think the one thing that I might add to this is that the Eurasia Group Foundation does an annual survey as well, which came out a couple of weeks ago, I believe, if I remember correctly. And they have a question where they ask more broadly about the support for the stationing of US troops abroad. And there you find more mixed results. And sometimes you'll see some people cite this, stating that this suggests that the American public wants troops withdrawn from South Korea. I think what we see here is that the American public actually does have different views of different situations, and that you need to really look at the question of how does the public feel about views in South Korea. And in this case, there actually is a strong well of support, and it's been consistent. The Chicago Council has done surveys on this as well, and they get similar results. So I think, whatever the American public may view writ large about US troop presences abroad, in the case of South Korea, at least, and I'm sure this is probably true for other situations if you were to poll on them, there is a strong degree of support for those troops being there.
So we have a question from the chat that I wanted to pose to you guys about the role of partisanship. It says generally how partisanship might be affecting foreign policy. I'm going to ask you guys a bit more specifically. Were there points in the survey where the difference between Democrats and Republicans really jumped out at you? Maybe on the US approach to North Korea or support for the US South Korea alliance? Areas, and I know we had some of the sidebars on the previous slide, for example, saying more Republicans are likely to think denuclearization of North Korea is very important than Democrats. Are there other points? And I know, Junie, you've talked about this a lot as well, so maybe you wanted to start us off there.
Sure. So similar to what we saw in last year's survey, generally on the policy-specific issues, something kind of like the importance of North Korea giving up its military nuclear weapons or troop support for South Korea, there is a little bit of variance, but for the most part, there's actually strong bipartisan agreement on those issues. It's only when you get to more kind of expectedly partisan issues, like the approval rating of the current administration, that you see a lot of that variance show up.
I think for me, the one thing that stands out, and Junie, would you mind if you can pull it real quick, putting up the slide on areas of cooperation with South Korea? Because I think this is where you start to see divisions. Republicans and Democrats tend to view the relationship with South Korea, at least how to move it forward, differently, with Democrats being more supportive of working with South Korea on issues like climate change, technology issues, and other things. And Republicans, generally speaking, seem to be much more focused on it as a security relationship. So you can see here, the partisan breakdown on global health is 58% Democrat, 31% Republican. Climate change, 62% Democrat, 14% Republican, though I'm sure that figure wouldn't necessarily surprise anyone. On technology infrastructure, so things like 5G, other things, 49% Democrat, 38% Republican. Global human rights, 60% Democrat, 34% Republican. So I think this, to me, is what's surprising, is that there's strong bipartisan support for the alliance with South Korea, for the troop presence in South Korea. But once you start getting into other issues and whether the US and South Korea should be working together, that starts to become, or at least it starts to break down, is probably a better way than to say it becomes partisan, because some of these issues like climate change clearly are partisan, unfortunately, but others, I don't think necessarily that anybody believes we should let the pandemic continue to go on, even if they have their own concerns about whether they should take the vaccine or they should wear a mask. So I think, that to me is what's interesting in terms of the partisan breakdown on some of these questions.
Yeah, and that's a perfect entry point. I actually wanted to talk about this topic next. And not only the partisan breakdown there, but also there is a little bit of a drop in support for cooperation with South Korea on some of these issues that I think both the Trump administration and the Biden administration would agree are critical for US interests. So you can see there's a 5 percentage point drop in Americans who think it's important to cooperate on development of international trade rules, a similar drop in cooperation on technology infrastructure, including 5G, almost a 10% drop in the number of Americans who think it's important to cooperate on global health. And this is interesting because, as I mentioned, especially on tech infrastructure, and you think about the Trump administration really taking aim at Huawei and Chinese companies that were engaged in 5G. There's a lot of convergence actually between Trump and Biden on some of these issues as priorities and critical US national interests. But the US public doesn't seem to have bought into this to the same extent that they have bought into, say, supporting the denuclearization of North Korea. So is this going to be a complicating factor for US South Korea policy? The fact that these issues seem to be more complex and fewer Americans are sold on this form of cooperation in the alliance context?
I do think it raises an interesting question for, how we cooperate with our partners abroad and what the extent of that cooperation is going to be. Some of this I think will take place on a policy level, and things like working together on international trade rules. This is going to be filtered more through the view more broadly of international trade in the United States, and I think it really will be on whether we're working with a partner like South Korea. So I think what you want to see here is that they see South Korea as a country that is beneficial to work with on trade. But I think it's often going to be colored by the broader view on trade. And so I think we should keep that in mind. We also had a question about whether trade with South Korea just in general was beneficial to the United States. And 63% of Americans view it that way. And that was consistent with last year as well. And at the same time, that's not a partisan issue. The Democrat and Republican views on that, if I remember correctly, were about 1% apart. So, thanks, Chief, for bringing that up. So you can see on this that there's a view that trade with South Korea benefits the United States. But at the same time, we also know that there are split views in the US right now on free trade. And so I think some of this is going to be colored by the domestic discussion. At the same time, I think what is interesting to me is that on climate change, the numbers are actually fairly consistent from year to year. So it's not surprising that North Korea would necessarily be the dominant issue. But I think what this says is that while Republicans are still skeptical of climate change, that this is an issue that sort of has some stability itself as well in terms of the US public view. And in that sense, it also suggests that perhaps it's one of the more prime areas to cooperate with South Korea on.
Yeah, I think one point to keep in mind as well, to circle back to an earlier aspect of our discussion, is there are a lot of policymakers who advocate positive cooperation in these fields as a way to prevent the U.S.-South Korea alliance from being dragged too far into U.S.-China competition. This isn't anti-China, but if the US and South Korea are cooperating to make international trade rules, that's leaving less room for China to unilaterally try and advance that discussion. So it's a good way to advance alliance cooperation without getting into territory that might make South Korea uncomfortable or go against what South Korea views as its national interests. But I think, going on what Troy said, there's some skepticism in the US about these issues as a whole. So it would be interesting to take South Korea out of the equation, and just how many Americans think it's important to cooperate on international trade rules at all. Not just specifically with South Korea, but with any country. The same for tech infrastructure and global health. Is there support for these issues? Maybe the administrations haven't really been making the case to the US public for why it matters that the US is engaged in international trade discussions and making international trade rules. And that might be something that the administrations need to pay a little bit more attention to.
I think that's a great point. We do some of these sort of broader based questions, but we haven't actually asked that. And maybe that's something we should look to, in our next survey, to kind of see then how the support for working with South Korea on these issues compares to just a generic support for working with other countries abroad. I think that's actually a good point. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have another question from the chat that I wanted to bring up. So we talked about US support for denuclearization of North Korea, and there's a question about US support for improving the US-North Korea relationship. And I know this survey touched in much more detail than we have so far on American views of certain policy aspects of North Korea. So Jeannie, I wonder if maybe you could bring up the slide that looks specifically on support for US aid to North Korea, US pandemic aid, because I know it's in there. And this is why I encourage anyone who's curious, if we don't get to your question, please check out the survey report, because your question very well might be answered in there. We do not have time to go through every single finding of the survey here today. But here you can see this slide, that there is almost, not quite, but almost a majority of Americans who approve of providing humanitarian assistance to North Korean citizens. It has dropped a little bit from 2020, which is interesting, but might be a partisan artifact, because as you can see in the sidebar, Democrats tend to approve of sending humanitarian aid to North Korea more so than Republicans. But it's possible that when a Republican president was in the White House, some of those Republicans were more inclined to send aid to North Korea, and now that they may have changed their minds. Because again, you see the disapprove rate remains the same. It's the not sure approve that we've seen that. So if we take this as kind of an oblique way of getting at the question of support for a thaw in US-North Korea relations, it does look like there's some support and some appetite for the US making positive outreach to North Korea. Jeannie, I don't know if there's any other aspects of the survey that might speak to that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I mean, I just pulled up the next slide here that's asking more specifically about the US providing COVID-19 assistance, which is interesting because compared to the previous slide that we're just taking a look at, we had a little bit under 50% for just kind of general humanitarian assistance, but specifically for asked about COVID-19, you do see that majority support, where there is 51% of people that do believe that providing COVID-19 assistance to North Korea is something they support.
And one other thing which I think is interesting looking at these numbers that I would add is that if you look at the 2020 data, that year actually it was a majority of Republicans and Democrats who favored COVID-19 assistance to North Korea. The numbers actually were pulled down by independents. And so in that sense, it wasn't at least a traditional partisan issue. And I'd have to go back and double check the humanitarian aid data, but I believe in that case, it also was fairly similar for Democrats and Republicans, which might then suggest some credence to your point, Shannon, that without a Republican in the office, Republican support for that specific policy measure has declined, but I need to double check that data.
I think it's also important to emphasize, as we did before, that the North Korea has a say in this as well. South Korea in particular has been offering and offering and offering COVID-19 related aid. And I believe the Biden administration has brought that up as well several times. And North Korea is just not interested. But it does seem like there is at least some public support for offering that sort of aid to North Korea, which might speak to our questioner's broader topic of do you Americans want to see a better U.S. North Korea relationship? And that might be a question to explore more specifically in a future survey. I think that would be an interesting topic to explore. We only have a few more minutes, and there is another question that I really want to touch on, because since the survey came out, there has been a huge topic of discussion in U.S. media focused on Korea, and that is Squid Game, the Netflix television show that seems to have taken all of America by storm. It came out after your survey, but you guys wisely included a survey question on Korean cultural products anyway. So I want to look at that and explore what this might mean. We talk a lot about soft power for countries, and it's the general sense that having popular cultural products could translate to actual national influence in some way. So this survey found that a huge majority of Americans do not actually identify as a fan of any Korean cultural product, whether that's K-pop or Korean television dramas, Korean movies, Korean beauty products. That may have changed now. We don't know what Squid Game, how much that has impacted general interest in these products. They would certainly assume that it's had a positive impact, at least a little bit. What I thought was interesting in the context of Squid Games was that among the people who do identify as fans, the people who follow Korean television dramas are far more likely to be interested in learning about Korea more broadly. And you can look in that chart on the right, 59% of people who watch Korean television shows are interested in learning about the Korean language. 74% want to learn more about Korean culture. 58% want to learn more about Korean history. So that seems to suggest that even though we often hear about K-pop as the premier Korean cultural product, that it's actually Korean television shows that have the most potential to translate into a more general interest and in an affinity for South Korea. So I want to kind of wrap up our discussion by talking about Squid Game and Korean soft power based on these survey results.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers, if you look on a demographic basis, rise when you get to younger Americans. So, you know, the survey is only for those between the ages of 18 and up. So we're not capturing a lot of younger Americans who are, you know, potentially listening to BTS or watching, you know, different, be it Squid Game or other Korean cultural content. But so in the broad sense, the numbers don't surprise me that it's so low. And that's sort of consistent with some data we had from last year's survey. But I'll be interested over time if this shifts. But to your point about dramas, I think what makes them unique is that, you know, any song is not necessarily going to be culturally specific, and it's a relatively low threshold of commitment and engagement by the consumer. While Korean movies or any movie is obviously longer, it's still, you know, we're talking about, you know, an hour and a half to maybe 3 hour commitment to watch that movie. But somebody who's going to engage in dramas, you know, they're committing to, you know, Squid Game is 9 episodes. A lot of series are, you know, 10 or more episodes. So you have a greater degree of commitment from your audience member. And also, you know, any drama is going to expose you to different aspects of South Korean culture. If it's a historical piece, you're going to be exposed to some aspect of Korean history. You know, if it's a contemporary piece, it's going to have more contemporary Korean culture. So in that sense, it's not surprising to me that if we're looking for how, you know, interest in Korean culture is going to grow in the United States, that the vehicle which is most likely to create that interest, not the only one, but the one that create the strongest interest, would-be dramas because it requires a greater deal of investment from the audience, and also it engages you on more levels. And I think this is going to be an interesting issue for South Korea more broadly going forward, because we didn't ask this question. It's something else that I'm thinking about going forward as we think about future surveys. But I would hazard a guess that most Americans consume Korean dramas via Netflix, and Netflix has invested a significant amount of money in the development of new Korean dramas. And so in a sense, I wonder if Netflix is going to be the platform, if you will, for the disbursement of Korean culture in the United States to a significant degree.
Yeah, and just to give some context of why we included this question, in the Korean watcher community, we hear a lot of anecdotes of a lot of people getting interested in learning more about Korea, and their gateway into it is through some sort of Korean cultural products, whether it's pop music or television dramas or whatnot. But I thought this was really interesting just because you hear, at least in the past few years, about how big some of these bands are, like BTS, and sort of the very passionate fandom culture around that. And based on the results, I mean, we have pretty small sample sizes in terms of the people that are actually self-identified fans of these things. Pop music is not the number one kind of carryover influencer in terms of encouraging more people to learn more about other aspects about South Korea. And I do find the timing of this survey interesting in light of Squid Game and how much influence it's getting. Even on my way to work today, NPR had mentioned Squid Game kind of offhandedly and how big it is, just how much it's broken into the mainstream. And it's interesting to me also because Squid Game and also last year's Oscar Best Picture winner, the Korean movie Parasite, touch on these very kind of dark themes of class struggle and really kind of give you a very kind of gritty, satirical look at it, but still one that obviously is relevant to not only Korean audiences, but audiences here in America as well. But it'd be interesting to see what the results are like for this survey a year from now, to see if a television drama like Squid Game encourages people to learn more about other aspects of Korean culture. Because for those who have watched the show, it's very much a Korean show. It very much touches upon a lot of different aspects of Korean culture and society.
And Squid Game itself is helping to propel greater interest in East Asian dramas. The two dramas that have seen the strongest growth, and they're not new on Netflix since Squid Game came out, which are the South Korean drama Sweet Home, and then there's also a Japanese sort of post-apocalyptic drama, I forget the name at the moment, as well. But those are the two shows that really seem to benefit from this. So it is developing in itself a greater interest in, at least generally speaking, East Asian content as well on Netflix. So it's having its own pull effect on the cultural side. And I also was reading that, apparently Squid Game costumes are becoming popular now. So it'll be interesting to see on Halloween how many people are dressed up in a Squid Game costume.
Yeah, Troy is actually working on an article for us about Netflix and South Korea through the lens of Squid Game. So look forward to that, because it is a fascinating question that Korean culture is being kind of catapulted into the American public consciousness, but mediated by an American company. And what does that mean? I think it's also going to be, as Junie said, really interesting to see if we see any shift in the number of Americans who identify as fans of Korean television, because anyone who has ever used Netflix and how their algorithm works, right? If you've watched Squid Game, you're going to get other Korean dramas recommended to you. It'll say at the end, because you watched this, here are some more. And so someone might decide to watch Sweet Home or Kingdom, or Netflix already has a vast library of South Korean television dramas on its service that haven't reached this level of massive popularity. But Squid Game could end up becoming kind of a gateway drug for South Korean popular culture. So it'll be very interesting to see that. Also, we didn't touch on this because we didn't have time, but you had a more detailed breakdown of, have you listened to these music groups? Have you watched this specific Korean television show or movie. And I'm assuming you're going to add Squid Game to the list next year. So we'll have a way to gauge, is this just an outlier that, 50% of Americans watched Squid Game and that was it, and no more Korean content? Or is there going to be a boost in the amount of Americans who consume Korean products? And so that is all the time we have for today. We had a great discussion. I think we got to most of the questions in the chat, but again, I would encourage anyone who still has questions, check out the survey, because there is a lot more there for you to think about. Some of your questions might be answered there. And also keep checking back on The Diplomat. Junie and Troy and several other KEI authors regularly write for us, and they're going to be teasing out some of these complex questions from the survey in the months to come as well. So Junie, Troy, thank you for this event. Thank you for putting together the survey to give us something to talk about. Thank you to everyone who joined us either live or post-recording on YouTube, and we look forward to hearing from you all.
Thank you, Shannon, as well, for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Shannon.